Hey everybody, in this video I'm going to talk about how to approach the CARS section in particular. So in the last section I talked about how to study and I talked about how you want to do a lot of reading beforehand and how you want to approach that type of reading. I'd recommend you check out that video. But let's say you've already done that, right? So now you've opened up the test and you've just started. And what do you want to do? How do you want to approach this section? So first of all, and I've talked about this in the last video also, you want to get used to the timing. So there are 9 passages, 90 minutes. That means there are about 10 minutes per passage on average. And that means you want to get used to being able to do each passage in a little bit less than 10 minutes. And some passages are going to take you more. But you want to aim for about 9 minutes per passage to give yourself time in case 1 or 2 passages end up taking you longer. And they will. Some of them will. That's just what always happens. All right. The strategy that I recommend, and you don't have to follow this strategy to be clear, but I would recommend this, is to pick the more interesting passages and read them first. So we all have different interests. And the nice thing about the MCAT CARS section is that it tests a lot of different material. So we've got social sciences and humanities. And here's a sample list of some of the subjects that are tested. And hopefully when you're glancing at these subjects, you're looking at these and you're saying, some of these look really interesting, right? And others look really boring. So for me, as I said, I was a political science major. So for me, a lot of the types of social science questions look really interesting. So for me, a lot of this stuff looks really interesting. And you might be looking at that and saying, yeah, I also feel the same way. But you might also be looking at that and saying, what the heck? Like these are the worst subjects on the test. And that's kind of by design. The way that the test is designed is typically you're never going to find more than like 1 or 2 passages on related subjects. So hopefully there are some subjects that you enjoy. And so when you open up the test, take a look at the first passage. If your immediate reaction is, I really do not want to read this, just skip that passage and go to the next one, passage number 2. And hopefully at some point you'll find a passage and you'll say, oh, this looks interesting. Looks like a passage that I'd want to read. And this is really where that practice that I talked about of doing a lot of reading on your own is really going to come in. When you read passages, when you read articles by yourself, that's what you do, right? You don't pick the articles that you hate. You start by picking an article that you like and you read it and you enjoy it and you say, okay, that was an interesting article. And so that's the strategy that I recommend. Pick a passage that you find interesting first. And that'll really help you to get into the groove of reading. Reading is really about getting in a zone or getting into the kind of a groove or getting into the flow, as some psychologists call it. It takes a while to get into it, but once you're into the flow or the groove of reading, you'll be able to read stuff that you find boring. But you want to start with stuff that's interesting. That's how you get into the flow in the first place. So again, skip a couple passages until you find one that you find interesting and then read it. Right? So really, there's no substitute for being able to read the passage. I know that some people or some tutors will recommend not reading the passage at all or just like really, really skimming it. And I don't think that's good advice. You're welcome to try that, of course, but I generally very strongly recommend that you read the passage first. Now you want to read it quickly. You don't want to read it like at a super leisurely pace. You want to read relatively quickly. And this is where, again, that practice reading gets in, which when you're doing that practice reading that I talked about in the previous video, you should be reading quickly. And so you should get used to reading maybe slightly faster than you're comfortable with, but such that you're still absorbing the main ideas of what you're reading. And always keep in mind when you're reading a passage that you don't have to memorize anything. The passage is right there. So if you come across a detail that you think is interesting, go ahead and highlight it. Right? Or a detail that you think is going to be relevant, or a detail that you're like, there's no way I'm going to remember this. That's not a problem. Just highlight it and be like, okay, that's, that was where that detail was. Make like kind of a mental note in your head and keep moving. And so again, start by reading things that you find interesting and things that you find easy or fun, and do those passages, and then move on to the next passages. And obviously, eventually you're going to have to do some of the boring stuff, some of the stuff that you hate. But hopefully by the time you get to those, you'll kind of have developed a groove and you'll kind of have gotten into the rhythm of reading such that you'll be able to focus much better and be a little bit more relaxed also on the next few passages. And so let's say you finish that first passage and you're still kind of having trouble getting into the next passage. Do another easy one. Do another one that you find interesting. You can skip around really as much as you want. Obviously, the only important thing is that you get all the passages done and that you don't accidentally miss a passage. And so if you're going to skip around, as I recommend you do, just make sure to double check that you're not skipping passages, and also make sure to keep your timing correct. So what I typically do on this section is I'll typically keep tally marks, right? And I'll typically write out, or sometimes write out numbers. So for example, I finished passage number 3, and then I'll write out, okay, I finished passage number 7. Okay, now I finished passage number 5, and then I'll write them out. And then when I'm doing the next passage, I'll say, okay, I finished, like, let's say I've also finished passage number 9, and I'll look and I'll say, okay, I've finished 4 passages. That means I should be done with 40 minutes. That means I should have 50 minutes left, right? And so again, I'll write out the passage numbers just to make sure that I know how many passages I've completed and how much time I've got remaining to complete the rest of the passages. But so skipping around is a strategy that I recommend. Again, you don't have to do that. Now, the second thing that I recommend is that when you're doing each passage, you can skip around within each passage, but always complete the passage before moving on to the next one. So never leave a passage before you've completed all its questions. Even if you have to guess, make sure to guess before you move on. You want to read each passage, do your best to answer the questions, and once you're done with that passage, purge what you just read from your memory and move on to the next passage. Passages, of course, are never going to relate. Like, there's never going to be an answer to passage number 3 in passage number 5. That's not how it works, right? And so you want to get good at sort of purging what you just read from your mind, and the best way to do that is to be able to finish every question before you move on. And so again, you can skip around on questions within each passage, but make sure to finish all those questions before you do the next one. And in terms of the order of questions, I recommend you do questions on the passage in this order. So after you finish the initial reading of the passage, so you've just finished and you've read the passage, and you might not fully understand the passage. Like, you might finish reading and say, I'm not 100% sure what that passage talked about, but I know, it talked about, rare violins, or it talked about whatever. And that's fine. And it's fine if you don't fully understand it when you finish reading it. I find that as I'm doing the questions, it sort of helps me to understand the passage. And the best way for me to do that is to start with low context questions. So usually there are 2 types of questions. There are questions that are going to be low context, by which I mean they usually reference one paragraph, one sentence, or even one word of the passage. So, for example, what does this word mean in this context? Or, what does this guy say about this? And there's going to be one particular sentence that tells you the answer. Right? So these questions are not too difficult. They might take you a little bit of time to find where in the passage the thing is mentioned, but it shouldn't be too hard for you to answer the question, and you don't really need to understand the whole passage to answer this question. When you come across a question like this, the first thing you want to do is you want to highlight what section of the passage is being referenced. So maybe they'll say in paragraph 2, and then in which case you want to take a look at paragraph 2, or maybe they'll say, this person says, and then you want to figure out where is this person mentioned. So maybe we're doing a political philosophy passage, and it says Rawls argues this. And okay, where do they mention Rawls? And go and find Rawls in the passage. Which, by the way, when you're doing reading, I would recommend you start highlighting names, because oftentimes names will be referenced, and it's just easier if you kind of know where the name was referenced beforehand. But you want to go ahead and highlight the part of the passage, whether that's the paragraph or the sentence that's being referenced. You want to figure out what the question is asking relating to that particular section, and then choose the best of 4 options. I think this part is fairly straightforward. And these questions, again, are easy to do even if you don't understand the full passage. But hopefully, as you're answering these low context questions, you're kind of getting a better understanding for the passage. So for example, let's say you read that particular paragraph that talked about Rawls and what Rawls argues, and now once you've reread that paragraph, you kind of have a better understanding of that paragraph, right? And so now you maybe have a better understanding of the passage. And if you do that for all of these types of low context questions, now when you jump to these high context questions that require you to understand the overall passage, you'll have a better understanding of the passage because you've reread a bunch of the paragraphs and maybe even skimmed them to really understand the passage a little bit better. And so for these high context questions, I recommend you take a look at the questions first. So for example, I've done all the low context questions on this passage, and now there are 2 high context questions. One of them is asking me maybe, what would be the best title for this passage? Or what would you say is the purpose of the passage? And then sometimes they might ask you a question like, what is the function of paragraph 3 in the argument that the author is making? And this is actually not a low context question. This is a high context question. The reason being that you really have to understand the whole article or the whole passage to understand how that particular paragraph fits into the whole. And so again, for these types of questions, you want to skim the passage again. Once you understand exactly what the question is asking, skim the passage and highlight any sentences that might be relevant. You want to be able to skim the passage very quickly. This is a skill that takes a bit of time to develop, to be able to skim something and find things that are relevant. And this is, something that you can practice as you are studying for your MCAT. But I would say that I skim the passage when I'm doing a CARS passage. I skim it multiple times, even after I've read it the first time. And I do it very quickly. Maybe it takes me maybe 30 seconds, maybe 15, 20 seconds sometimes, depending on how hard the passage is or how many times I've already read it. Highlight any sentences that might be relevant to that particular question, and then choose the best of 4 options. If you have time, and sometimes you don't have time, and that's okay. And this is where the timing comes in. You want to check the clock and see how you're doing on that particular passage. Oh, maybe, I've only taken 6 minutes on this passage. Okay, no problem. I can, I have more time on this passage. Or maybe, I'm already at 11 minutes on this passage. Okay, I'm done here. I don't have time to check my work. Maybe I'll flag it. And if I have time at the end, I can go back. But I'm going to assume I probably won't. And so I'm going to guess, and I'm going to be happy with my choice, and I'm going to move on. And if you do have time, again, you can go back and skim through the passage again. And make sure that your options are correct. Make sure that the option that you chose fits, and there isn't maybe a sentence in the passage that would lead you to pick a different answer choice, or that would lead you to think that the answer choice that you picked is wrong. Now, I have to admit that being able to do this, to answer these types of questions, and to keep the timing at the same time, and to read the passages, all of this is not easy, and it takes a lot of practice. And it's really a skill that you develop. And so I generally recommend that if you're struggling with cars and this section is not coming naturally to you, for some people it does come actually pretty naturally. For some people this is pretty much their best section and they don't study too much for it. But a lot of people find it difficult, and they find it difficult to really develop these types of skills. And if that's you, then I recommend you start by doing this section without timing. And so you don't have to do this on a practice test, but for example, you can use some of the section banks, and don't, do them without timing. See if you can at least find the right answers when you're not time crunched, when you're not limited with time, right? Because the right answers are always there. I know that people think that the section is subjective, and that sometimes answer choices are subjective, that 2 answers are both perfectly correct, but that's not true. There's always a sentence or a hint in the passage that leads you to understand why, the answer choice that you thought was correct is actually wrong, or the answer choice that, of the 2 answer choices that you thought might be correct, one of them was the more correct one. And I'll talk more about approaching difficult questions in the future. So that's going to be part 3 of this series. But here I do just want to make the point that there always is a right answer, and you can always find it, at least on the AAMC questions. Sometimes, I will say, some of the third-party test makers write really bad CARS questions where there actually can be multiple correct answers. And this is why I generally don't recommend people use non-AAMC practice questions for CARS, unless you have to. If you have to, then, if you run out of practice questions, then that's fine. But the AAMC really is the gold standard here. Their reasoning process and their way of writing questions is by far the best. And so this is the approach that I recommend for the CARS passage and the general approach to CARS questions. As I said, I'm going to do a third part in this series where I take a look at very specific types of questions, and very specifically how to answer those types of questions for this section on the MCAT. So make sure to take a look at that. And thank you for watching.